Greetings, all you fine feathered folk out there in listener and viewer land, and welcome to the second installment of the Disinformed Book Club. I'm Shane.
I'm Michael.
I'm Courtney.
In case you just stumbled onto this randomly, we host a weekly podcast called the Disinformed Podcast. And you can check out our channel here. You'll be able to discover what we do on the regular and see if you're interested in checking that out. But we are all constant listeners here and have ridden the rails of infamy for just talking about Stephen King stuff pretty regularly. And so we decided to convene the occasional book club here, since I am foisting off on my friends a bunch of Stephen King material so that they can share in my joy. And so this time we have elected to discuss the glorious book, Mr. Mercedes. And it's everybody's first time around the bend other than mine, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Well, we recently did a panel at Phoenix Fan Fusion where we talked about The Outsider and if it bleeds as well to a certain extent. And I know we were all fairly taken with Holly Gibney as a character, so I said, hey, you should all go investigate her origin story and get a little backstory leading into other things. But since I was chastened previously by one of our super fans, Stephen, for having Courtney on to discuss her opinions on it and then me talking for the bulk of the time, I'm going to hand it over to you, Miss Courtney, to discuss your feelings initially, at the very least, and then we'll get into nitty gritty. But what did you think about the book?
I really enjoyed it. I thought it felt like it went with The Outsider. It felt like it all really led into The Outsider, and I really love like dual narration in a book where you get the perspective of your hero and your villain.
Mm-hmm.
So this book did that really well for me. I really enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
You watch the two trains as they're converging, essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I will state for the record, if you didn't already know, this is a trilogy here, so there are a couple other books you can get into to segue through the full gambit. But Michael, how about you? What'd you think about it? I know you're averse to crime fiction in general, as you've mentioned previously.
It was not what I was expecting, because I was like, and granted, because of The Outsider, I was expecting it to be a little bit more police procedural. I was glad it was not.
Yes.
It was a lot more of a thriller, which is easier for me to get into. It was interesting reading a Stephen King book without any hint of the supernatural. Because that's one thing that really, I really enjoy about him is that he does a lot of the cosmic horror aspects for a lot of the books that I've read. But it was interesting to see just the characters and how they're driven to do the things that they do without that touch of the supernatural. So I enjoyed it a lot more than I expected.
Well, I look forward to, if you elect to read the other books in the series, having a follow-up.
I already have Finders Keepers loaded up and ready to go.
Okay, fantastic. Well, when we get through the end of Watch, we'll have another discussion, and we'll be able to tie up a loop here.
It was the other two. It was End of Watch, then Finders Keepers is the third one, right?
No. End of Watch is actually the end.
Okay, so I did choose the right one. Okay.
You certainly did.
Good.
Certainly. So on the topic of how this differs from a lot of other material, the thing that I appreciate is, one, this is noted as being what King calls his intro to the hard case crime kind of rationale that he uses for Joyland and Colorado Kid and later as well. But this was kind of his getting his brain into investigatory matters.
Oh, this is his first one. I didn't know that.
It doesn't technically fall into that category, but it is a kissing cousin to that concept, which is really fun. And so it gives you the idea of dealing with, our good old debt ret Bill Hodges and how he goes about investigations. which is a really interesting precursor to Ralph Anderson and,
Yeah.
Hawley's sort of correlatives between the two. So it's
Mhm.
really fun for me to think of you all doing it backwards, of
Yeah.
first
Yeah.
riding the rails with Ralph and then going back to see what you get from Bill Hodges. The thing I really appreciate about this versus a lot of other King material is how the book starts, because they give you the inciting incident and you have a feeling like, oh, okay, these are characters that I'm going to live for a while with. And you get, an interesting perspective on a couple of people, and there's this fun little kindling of a situation of maybe I'll take her out to breakfast kind of thing. For those of you who have not read the book previously, I would recommend doing so, because we're going to kind of hint and allude to certain things and not necessarily just go blow by blow for the plot descriptions.
Mhm.
But for this in particular, it starts at a job fair in a current status of the economy where things are going pretty well off the rails, and so there's a lot of people out of work, and so they're trying to find some sort of succor, and by doing this they're going to a job fair that promises something like
1,000
new jobs. And so folks are lining up over the course of the evening in order to get decent purchase, and so we follow a character as he is approaching, initially discovers a young lady who has an infant with her, who is standing out there in the freezing cold at 3 a.m. And just a really interesting scenario. So there's a fun hook to the story, and then the misfortune happens.
Mhm.
So I really appreciate that as a juke. It's not as horrific as The Outsider is conceptually,
Yeah.
which
Yes.
is saying something to
Yeah.
speak to how graphic The Outsider's depiction of the violence is. But this is certainly absolutely horrible. And since we have seen several similar acts of terrorism in domestic circumstances, not that far afield, unfortunately, these days. So
Mhm.
everybody else like the intro, similar feelings, or was that a weird situation?
I didn't think it was weird at all.
Okay.
Even jumping to other characters after the intro, I was completely okay with, because he used the characters to set the whole setting.
Mhm.
Like, I knew where it was, and it was a decent callback to, because this book came out in 2010 and it was written primarily during the what do they call it? The Great Recession.
Mhm.
So where everyone was down on their luck, being fired, etc. And so you got that. I was immediately able to connect with the setting and understand what was going on. So even if we didn't have the characters from the beginning, I still understood and was hooked into the book,
Okay.
regardless if, yeah.
Quinkadinkly, this is the book that immediately followed Dr. Sleep.
Oh,
Oh, okay.
that's
As
super
far as the
interesting.
release timeline. So, funnily enough, you get at least some degree of continuity as you're reading through, Courtney. But
Uh-huh.
how was that for you as a handshake for the beginning of the book?
It hurt. And I think that was why it was so good, is that it humanized these characters and then
Mhm.
immediately ripped them away from you. Like when he was thinking about, like, maybe I could pretend to be the father of the baby and help
Mhm.
her so she didn't look irresponsible. And it was like, I knew that something bad was coming because we had kind of discussed the plot previously. So I
Mhm.
knew it was going to hurt, but it didn't change the fact that he had really developed these characters. He gave them a backstory only to then rip it away from them.
Well, and it also makes the crime all the more harrowing, because if they just
Yeah,
describe, oh, there was a guy who drove into a crowd in a giant Mercedes, it
right.
wouldn't have been as impactful, because you kind of have a filter through which you're seeing that. But when you've become attached to these characters, it's a big stab. So I really appreciate about his writing style in general, that he gets you to
Mhm.
invest in characters so readily.
Mhm.
And I've
Yeah.
said he's a master at starting books. Everybody can argue about whether or not you think he finishes them well, but he really does set scenery and get you invested in stories almost immediately, which I really love.
Mhm. I agree completely. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, like his strength is characters.
Mhm.
He has, like, not a lot of other authors have that sort of similar strength where everything focuses on the characters. And they either, and especially in this case for this book, the characters themselves are the driving force behind what's happening, which is why I wanted to see what was going on with the book, because I knew there wasn't a supernatural event going on. It was all character driven events. So it was really cool to see the characters that he created, one, and two, not just how they reacted to events, but how they drove them, how they created their own. So.
And speaking of characters and character development, I will say Bill Hodges is one of my favorite protagonists in the course of the King mythos, and I really appreciate, because you start him out in a real bind emotionally and kind of in the dregs of his life, as it were, and then get to sort of see him flourish and bloom before more tragedy and harrowing events start to unfold. So it's a very interesting dynamic to see a character where he finally starts to kind of rejuvenate a little bit and then get dragged right back down into the muck. But
I immediately, and it's because you put it in my head, like I now see connections between him and Danny Torrance, especially because they were right after each other. He started each of these books when they're at pretty much their lowest peak, and it shows them, improving their lives, getting better. Granted, Danny was a lot longer term, and there was a lot more substantial things going on, whereas Bill Hodges was more of a getting back and finding a purpose for his life again, as opposed to Danny, where he was building himself up from nothing. But it was still interesting. Yeah, I agree. Like seeing him at his what's the correct term, nadir, pretty much the lowest point in his life per se, and then building it back up. And yeah, he does run into a lot of other things, but it's one of those things where it's like, well, what if this happened to him at the beginning of the book, as opposed to halfway through, when he was already building himself back up and seeing that improvement, how he would react to it. Like you could already tell like these different character aspects to him and how they change even within like a couple of chapters. It's really it's really fascinating to me just see that character development that quickly.
Well, and good police work for being that the thrill of the hunt is the thing that sort of re-engages him initially, and then it really gets reinforced as he goes forward. But how about you, Courtney?
No, I think I agree with you as far as being kind of a favorite protagonist, at least of the few books that I've read thus far. I appreciated the way he brought the police work knowledge to what he was doing, and knowing like the line in the sand where like I can do this, but once I step over this line, then it's all to shit, like nothing will matter. Or even just his struggle of wanting to call his friends that were still at the station and get them involved in what he was doing. I thought that kind of push and pull between instinct and how he was trained as a police officer made it a much more interesting story overall.
And riding the line between justice and retribution. And that's the real struggle over the course of a lot of the story. And it really does, particularly once the situation with Janie escalates to where it does. That's where the retribution line definitely gets solidified. It was like, no, this is for me. It was bad enough before, but
he went from trying to avoid being Uncle Bill, to reference to the book, but then once the event with Janie happened, he went full on uncle, calling all of his favors, like trying pretty much. At that point, he accepted that he was going to get in trouble for going further than he should legally, but he didn't care. He just wanted to make sure that it would happen, that he got, not even he, but that justice was served in that regard. So.
And very thirst quenching retribution by the time you get around. But on that notion, you can't speak about the protagonist without the antagonist, and I feel like this book definitely benefits from having a really tepid and disgusting one in Brady Hartsfield. Certainly, it's in my top 10, and there are a lot of King villains I have encountered. Hartsfield's one of the more intriguing ones for me. But again, I say this knowing full well this isn't the end of Brady's story. So I will refrain from further discussion there, but at least as far as establishing the character and just how sadistic and insidious he is, is something that really makes you want to see him get that comeuppance and a little retribution as you go along. But what did you all think of him?
Since I keep going first,
Mm.
Corey, you go right ahead.
I thought he was a really excellent villain. I think that the way he kind of was always looking ahead at the next thing, and it was like, oh my God, is that really what he's gonna do? Is he, gonna make that choice and cause that, thing without totally spoiling the plot? But it was just the kind of the back and forth of his thought process with the police work that was happening on Bill's side, especially when it came to the online chat room. I thought that stuff was really, really interesting. But yeah, for me, he was just a really great villain because you loved to hate him. Like, I think he also did generate a little bit of like, you wanted to feel bad for him. His circumstances weren't awesome by any means.
That's one of the reasons why I love Stephen King characters. Like, even the ones that you hate, a lot of the times he gives you reason to, like, they're not just one dimensional. Like, you can hate him, but you also understand at least partially where he's coming from.
Yeah, everyone's the hero of their own story, right? So you can cognitively reframe to make things look like you're the one who was jilted and scorned and left in situations you were. And I mean, it's very difficult to say you walk up to a compelling character because of an incestuous relationship with his mother, but it's such a bizarre turn, and King does much stranger throughout the course of a bunch of other stories. So I'm not really shocked by it, but it was one of those in the course of reading it, I was like, okay, this took a turn.
I have a headache.
Yeah, definitely
help me,
was
mommy.
not prepared for this. So
no.
And all of that is to say, we're going to hit the highlights as we run through here. But since the both of you have experienced If It Bleeds as well as some of the foundation for The Outsider, now that you get to see Jerome in his, sort of burgeoning state as well, feel a little bit different, or?
I mean, I liked him in If It Bleeds.
He's a fun character.
Yeah, any passing reference to him in The Outsider. I'm kind of glad that he kind of dropped his Tyrone feel good kind of thing, because that always makes me uncomfortable.
Well, we just transferred over to John Law when you get to If It Bleeds. So,
but I liked him. I liked seeing Barbara also as more younger and as a very tertiary character.
And you get to understand what their motivations are going forward and the things that formulated at least their bond between all those characters as friends.
Yes, definitely. I liked him. I'll just keep repeating that.
Yes.
Cool. I think he's a really enduring character. I think he was almost a little bit of the relief from some of the dark stuff, and I think that was very much needed. And I think also his struggle with his sister and mom being involved was really impactful and really important to the story.
Yeah, it gives you stakes when you get to the climax. And he also humanizes Bill as you go, because it's that one connective tissue back to the real world as you go through the story, which is important to help when you do get to the point where Holly Gibney is introduced, that you appreciate why Bill wants to help to kind of nurture her and bring her out of her shell. One, circumstances. So you want all hands on deck given what was going on. But furthermore, just to see somebody who is capable but is being suppressed actively. And so before we get around to the reason we're all here, which is chatting about Holly, how do we feel about Janie and her introduction and the understanding of why it was a little difficult for the ugly duckling of Holly Gibney to try to thrive when you've got Jane leading the way?
I mean, I felt that was okay. I would have been a lot more upset if they pursued, or if Stephen King tried to pursue Bill and Holly as a relationship after Janie. because then
Yeah,
I
I
felt
don't
like it
think
would have
that's at all their dynamic.
exactly.
Yeah.
No, I agree completely.
Mhm.
That was the thing that I was happy for, because instead of having them be like diametrically opposed, where Janie was very full of life and, open, free to do whatever, and Holly was not, it was good to see that, like, yeah, they were opposites in a lot of that regard, but they weren't, connected through being romantically inclined towards Bill. And
Right.
that was like one of those things where it would have felt too much, it would have been too cliched, way too
Yeah,
cliched.
no, he was far more of a father figure, I think, than
Yes,
than
and
the
I'm
other. Yeah.
so happy that that was the case. And I mean, like, yeah, that's very obvious in The Outsider, like,
Mhm.
especially whenever Hollywood referred to him, it was definitely very evident that there was that fatherly aspect.
Mhm.
I'm just glad that it started from that point. I didn't really expect it to go that other way,
Yeah,
but
I
I
was
was
gonna
just
say
like,
good.
I was so happy that I didn't have to be let down.
You don't want someone homie hopping when it's been a tragic circumstance of just like, well, hey, by the way, if you need a
I
surrogate.
I mean, I'm very partial to romances in books, because a lot of the time I feel like it's ham-fisted or
Yeah.
forced, where it's
Mhm.
like, they've only known each other for 5 minutes. Why are they getting together? And it bothers me to that point, but I appreciated how Janie was kind of introduced and
Mhm.
then led into being a romantic interest,
Yes.
not necessarily for the romance.
Yes,
I
it's
mean,
not,
yeah.
just stumbling into a supply closet with Sergei after a game of hide and seek.
Yeah, hide the sausage. But it was a lot nicer, and it even led up to the potential for maybe in the future, which I feel like that is how relationships kind of blossom, at least in more realistic terms.
Mhm.
Like, the love at first sight thing always just bothers me seeing in that. And I understand from like a movie or TV show, it's like this character only has like a couple hours of screen time, or
Mhm.
maybe a dozen or so pages of book time, and you somehow have to get them together. But it always bothers me when there's not that like prerequisite work being put
Yeah.
in to establish the relationship, instead of saying, I love you, but I only met you a page ago, but I love you.
Well, and also like pointing out that all of this was sort of galvanized, or it coalesced around the fact that it's her relative who had the Mercedes stolen and was also
I-
driven to take her own life. So I mean, when you trace Holly back, at least going forward, to all of this as well, it really informs her character, because that's a lot of tragedy to sort
oh
of
yeah.
beset that family in particular. So you really understand a lot more why her dynamic with her mom is all the more, frightening and vexing by the time you get around to If It Bleeds, because there's a lot that's informed their dynamic.
Hmm.
Totally.
But what do you think about Janie there, Miss Courtney?
I really liked her as a character,
Mhm.
and I feel like her relationship with Bill was very indicative of a lot of people who are going through grief and just kind of needing someone to get through it, regardless of if that's going to be a long-term relationship or even just we're comforting each other, because
Mhm.
he was kind
Yeah.
of grieving the loss of his career and the loss of not catching Brady, but even though he didn't really know that's what the situation was yet. And then in addition to that, it's her loss of her sister.
Mhm.
So really it was almost more of, I think they almost had more of a friendship that was physical, more so than some kind of great love story,
Right.
Hmm.
just in the sense of, I just need someone to get me through this really rough time. And I thought that that was a really interesting dynamic to add to the story.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not going to linger on this for too long, but it was funny because you both read the book, cover to cover. I haven't read it in a minute, but I picked it up last night and blitzed through about 80 pages of my favorite passages because I knew kind of where the sections were I wanted to look at to remind myself. But one of the things I stumbled on that I'd forgotten was the first time that she and Bill are intimate. And to this point, King is not gratuitous with sex scenes most of the time. It
I was gonna
usually
say.
it's alluded to, or it's just sort of like something where it's discussed, or like, oh, we had a little loving, or it's a build up to it. You
Mhm.
occasionally have moments where it's required, like unfortunately for things like Gerald's Game or other things where you have a full illustrative blow by blow. But this was
Or
one of the
it.
more endearing moments. And something I really appreciate about talking about character development, where you have JD who basically just said, just shut up and lay there. I don't want anything from you. It's been a long time. It's been a year since I've had sex, and the last time wasn't great. So I need this, and I deserve this. That line always cracked me. I was like, I deserve this. So,
It was very touching. It felt very real instead of like I said before with
yes,
the love at first sight.
swarthy
It was
romance novel kind of,
yeah,
bluster and stuff. It's like, oh, here's the fat guy who's worried
like
about whether or not he's going to be able to maintain. Yeah.
it's like just hold on,
Oh,
think what did she say? Count backwards and think of xylophones or something like
Yeah,
that.
I
Or
forget the exact phrase,
yeah.
but yes, it's basically try to do
She's like
arithmetic in your head. Yeah.
she's like, you better hold on, do whatever it takes.
Yeah.
I want this, I need this. Just
Anyway, sorry.
there.
Wasn't going to linger too long in that, but I was one of those where it's like, as a character, when you see a man write a female character, most of the time you fall into very stereotypical patterns. And maybe this is still, as I'm a man having this perspective, so obviously I can't empirically state, but that felt to me far more respective of a woman's actual perspective. Just like, please don't ruin this for me. Just shut up and sit there.
Yeah.
It's hard enough to get around the bend on my own. I don't need you screwing this up. So that finally leads us into unfortunate incident and a funeral and a young lady sitting out on a stoop enjoying a cigarette, shamefully hiding it from her family. When you first encounter Holly in If It Bleeds, could you have imagined this was the origin of the character?
If I hadn't read The Outsider and I
Mhm.
only read If It Bleeds, I would say no. I did not. I would not have expected this to be her introduction and her character type.
Mhm.
So you still
Yeah.
saw. Sorry, I paused to give you plenty of
No, I was
space, and
going to
then I
agree with
jumped
you,
in.
so we're good.
But there is some part of it still in The Outsider. You can still see it. She's a lot air quotes better. It's a
Mhm.
difficult word to use. She's a lot more socially well adjusted, I
Mhm.
think is the better way to put it. But there's still some of that hesitation, some of that still pre-outsider Holly. But by the time If It Bleeds, she's already had to do her own thing. And I think If It Bleeds is set like a year or two after The Outsider. So she's
Correct.
and The Outsider, kind of spoilers, but Bill Hodges is dead by
Mhm.
The Outsider.
Yeah, there's a
And
lot of
he's
stuff
been
you have to fill in between these stories before we get to that. But
yeah.
yes, there's a lot
So
of growing that occurs with the character.
yeah, exactly. And it doesn't it kind of explicitly says in some points whenever they introduce her back into it, but like I feel like I'm rambling now.
No, but you understand her trepidation
Yes,
about presenting
yes.
things that seem. And here's what's so funny. I'm really relishing being able to start talking about this with you as we start putting the connective tissues in there, because again, they do allude to the fact that she does have supernatural elements that she's experienced previously, and she alludes to Brady. So
Mhm.
I'm sure there's a lot of questions lingering in your minds that you will get to answer as we move along. But yes, you do have to, you understand why she has the trepidation and why she's worried, because she's still just jibba jibba in the back of her mind.
Oh.
And so it's really fun to watch her evolution as you run through. So I look forward to seeing that. But what about you, Courtney? What was this the impression or how you thought this might have started?
I think yes and no. I think there was definitely, like, even in The Outsider, her thinking back to smoking and her kind of thinking back to the person she had been, and it kind of alluded to that a little. I think her kind of coming from this very, like, almost want to say like a balled up place of just like, yeah, I don't really have control over anything that's happening to me, so I'm just going through the motions, to actually being empowered to be a part of actually solving crimes and being a
Mhm.
part of even just her determination with, I'm going to solve the password on this computer. Like, I can do that. Just give me the time. I think was already alluding to how far she would go. And I have really appreciated, it's almost like reading her backwards, because
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
started with If It Bleeds. I'm kind of excited to see like what else they kind of throw at us through the next 2 books, to
Yeah.
really finally like close it all into a nice little
Neat little
king
bow.
circle.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And here's where we'll go into major spoiler territory, and we're not going to get crazy, but if you haven't read the book, be mindful if you're going to proceed here. But when you do get to the climax of the story, the thing that I really love and appreciate, which kind of endears me most to Holly, is that Bill, who we've been waiting for the entire story to do the typical heroic thing of charge in, immediately nail the bad guy and lock it down, we don't get that. You get Bill having a heart attack, and then you think, okay, well, Jerome, he can go in there because Holly doesn't seem entirely capable. But you watch Holly start to become capable over the course of things unfolding. And then Jerome is so taken with the fact that he wants to get his family out of there. The person least likely to have any impact on how this story turns out is Holly. And so when you get the introduction of her floating with the happy slapper, it is such a shock and such a really brilliant moment to give her that climax. Makes me just elated every time I think about it. So that's why I think I'm as attached to Holly as I am. Added to which all these other stories that start moving forward, like, yeah, she's delightful. But that was such a fun, you know, function against type. And
Mm-hmm.
It was great, not just because it was like Bill turned at the last second and
mhm.
said, "No, you need to do it," Holly. It was because Brady already knew Bill and
Mhm.
Jerome. So it
Yep.
had to be someone that he wasn't familiar, or else he would do the
Yep.
things that he needed to do. So it was a perfect setup for that sort of, it's now in her court and she needs to do it. And I'll admit, when I read that section, I immediately went back to The Outsider
Mhm.
and how,
it spoils it a little bit, yeah.
but then I remembered people not liking how The Outsider ended.
Mhm.
And I'm like, why? It wasn't like it was completely out of the blue. This had happened before.
Mhm.
It what like I would have been a little bit more understanding of their like being upset that Holly had used the happy slapper in The Outsider if she didn't even touch it in Mr. Mercedes.
Yeah.
But that was the climax.
But I think it's also people who didn't read Mr. Mercedes. And I think that was one of the things I mentioned when we were talking about it
Okay.
at Fan Fusion, is there are people who read The Outsider completely oblivious to Mr. Mercedes who have no clue what the happy slapper is. So it does seem completely out of a clear blue sky when you don't know what the
Okay.
history is. So this is the thing that imbues it with that weird mythical lore.
Okay. Because I mean, it felt perfectly fine without reading Mr. Mercedes, in my
Mhm.
opinion. But reading Mr. Mercedes made it perfectly make sense for The
Yeah.
Outsider, because it, and even so, if it gave it more weight in Mr. Mercedes, because
Mhm.
it was her first time using the happy slapper
Yep.
and understanding it and embracing something that wasn't necessarily her own, because it
Right.
was definitely clear that it was Bill Hodges, thing. But to have her just be able to not just use it, but use it, I
To
wouldn't say
devastating
perfectly.
effect, yes.
Yes, yeah. I almost said perfectly. I'm like, well, it could have been
Less
more
egregious,
complete.
yes.
It could have been more complete in my, I don't want to spoil exactly.
Mhm.
It could have been more complete and maybe avoided the other 2 books, but that's neither here nor
Well,
there.
it's not going to avoid the second book, so get that out of
Okay.
here.
Well, that's fine. But it was, I agree with you. That ending, that the climax was just perfect. Chef's kiss. And I can see why. I mean, he really enjoys writing with writing for Holly.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well,
I mean,
Mhm.
he's named one of his dogs Holly Gibney.
yes, but also not to get too far off of the point you were making
Sorry.
of like the Happy Slapper has this talismanic quality to her because one, it's Bill's weapon,
Mhm.
and two, it was given to her with that trust. So it was that one critical moment where she was finally given responsibility and not just been like, oh, poor Holly, she can't do anything. So it's
Mhm.
this really beautiful vessel of empowerment for her as a character, which I really cherish and kind of appreciate. So yes, when other people were criticizing it, I was like, you don't understand what it is and what it's emblematic of to her. But how about you, Courtney? I was waiting for your response to this
Yes,
the
yeah.
entire
I
time.
want to get
so.
my boring stuff out of the way because you didn't get your
Oh my God,
your
are you guys
time
ever gonna let
before.
that go?
I was part of it. It's something I'm gonna have to, it's the guilt that I have
No.
to live with, that I stole your time to properly just love on Holly Gibney as a character. So it's
And now you're doing it again.
I'm gonna take it to my deathbed. And this
Reclaiming
as
my
well.
time.
Yeah.
I think what you just said, Shane, about how the connectivity of King books, I think that you lose some of the richness if you don't know.
Mhm.
And we talked about that with when I read, oh God, here we go. Good memories.
It's okay. It happens.
When I read 11/22/63,
Yes.
and I was like, oh, is that a reference to it? Because I had no idea.
Oh, yeah.
And I had messaged you and I was like, am I missing something here? And you're like, oh yeah, no, you're totally you're totally missing something. And I think with The Outsider, I think for people who didn't enjoy it, like this is the missing piece.
Mhm.
And I like what you said about it being a talisman, because I think that was like almost like her safety blanket of like, no, like he believes in me, so I can do it.
Yep.
And I just found her to be such an endearing character because she was kind of defying the odds of her own life. Nobody had given her the freedom or the respect to make her own choices. And then in comes this ex-detective guy who's breaking the rules and doing all kinds of shit, but for a cause.
Mhm.
And she's like, oh yeah, like I can get on board for that. Like that gives me meaning as well. And I think that's the piece where I really connect, is just, no, you can just do it because you want to do it. You
Mhm.
don't have to do what your psycho mom wants you to be up to, or what is expected of you. You can continue to grow, and I love that about her.
He believed in her that she could do it on her own, and
Mhm.
that was the only thing she needed to hear. Not even that like, you know how to do it or whatever. It was just like, you can do it. You are your own
Mhm.
person.
Mhm.
you
And it's
know?
subverting that expectation, firstly, but then secondarily, it's that she's discovering just how capable she actually is. And I think
Right.
there's a suspicion of that, but she's always been more afraid of what she's capable of. And then putting into account that we aren't discussing the fact that she is neurodivergent, which added into the mix as well, puts a whole new complexion on the matter on top of it. So showing that she is completely capable of doing all of these things, just needed somebody to actually trust her to do that and not necessarily just approach something in a linear fashion, which it's an interesting metaphor for the whole story because they are operating outside of the lines of normative behavior. They're not following the rule of law. They are functioning on vendetta. And then when you start allowing her to drift that way, she's saying, hey, I'm not normal. It's the, I am
Mhm.
myself, strange and unusual. So you get that interesting incentivization for her because it's like, hey, I can do this. I know how to hack into this. I know how to do this. And you watch the lights start to kind of turn on over the entire city. By the time you finish up, she's awash in light, which is really fantastic and a great metaphor for a character, something I really appreciate about the story. So I'm glad that you all finally get to see that as it starts.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even just like when she showed up to the electronics store before them, and just she knew what was going on
Mm-hmm.
the whole time. She just needed that the little push, like we've been talking about. And I'm very excited to read the next one.
Okay.
Same.
Yeah, it's they're both there's a lot of folks that lambast Finders Keepers purely because it does a hard right away from this story for a certain extent. And it's kind of one of these where you're like, oh, okay, but I keep trying to reframe to folks as like, consider the way you felt with the opening chapter of Mr. Mercedes, because that had very
Sure.
little to do with the overall plot. So when you start getting the introduction, the hooks are going to be set with Finders Keepers, and I actually really enjoyed that book. I felt it was probably as engaging to me as Mr. Mercedes was initially. So there's a lot of fun stuff in there to be discovered. So I look forward to following this up as we move forward. So we'll get further into it. But I'm assuming I don't necessarily have to, but we'll get a round of applause from everybody here. So Courtney, for Mr. Mercedes, thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs in the middle.
Thumbs up for sure. I really enjoyed it.
Fantastic. And Michael.
Thumbs up. I was expecting thumbs in the middle, but no, thumbs up. It was I'm really beholden to horror nowadays. I absolutely love it. That's why I read through all of H.P. Lovecraft and how it was so easy to move into Stephen King when you pretty much told me, yeah, there's a lot of cosmic horror in there. I was like, sign me up. It was really awesome to read one of his works that didn't have it, like I said earlier. So yeah, thumbs very up.
Cool. And I know that was something I was worried about for you because you were not the police procedural guy. So there's enough. It's more a psychological thriller, but I will lay a little seeds in the ground here. You have some supernatural material to look forward to. It will be in the offing. You just got to wait a little bit.
Which I'm perfectly okay with because honestly, I like the characters with or without supernatural elements. So.
Yes, and I'll be very interested to hear what you think about that when we get around to it, because that is another source of controversy amongst King's fans when you get to End of Watch. So we'll get to that. But thank you all for being here and being flies on the wall for our general group discussion here. I hope, if you haven't read the book, please go check it out, because if you're a fan of King at all or an aficionado, or if you're just somebody who enjoys a good crime drama, it's a fantastic book, well worth exploring. But if you want to explore something a little further, we, of course, have new episodes of our podcast where we explain random esoteric nonsense to one another and lie occasionally, which come out every single marvelous Monday morning through your preferred podcast provider app. So go check those out if you're inclined. See what we do in our spare time. And also, we have got a slew of other material here on the Tubes of You, which includes bad fan fiction, other discussion about books, and other ghastly impressions of Michael's shorts. So you can scope all of that material out as well. But if you've appreciated our conversation here, and if you've enjoyed yourself while watching, there are ways that you can express that to us, and Michael will tell you how.
You can smash that like button, ring the bell, hit subscribe. Let's see what else. Oh yeah, there's a join button that you got to do, and then type some random. Yeah, I was gonna say type some random letters or characters into the comments. Doesn't have to be coherent. It could be like me.
You could meet us under the blue umbrella.
Oh, I can be Kermit Frog 19.
Indeed, you can. Well, I think that is going to officially wrap things up like a closing umbrella for our particular discussion here. But stay tuned, and we'll see you on the next round. So for the Disinformed Book Club, this time I'm Shane.
Ooh, I'm Michael.
I'm Courtney.
And we will catch you on the flip side.
And zippity zoop, we're out of here.
Books closed.